Relaxing by a backyard fire is the perfect way to spend an evening. Here's how to build a classic in-ground fire pit. This fire pit sits below ground with a small patio surround. Other types of fire pits can be built from kits and traditional retaining wall blocks. Check out our other videos to see how to build these styles. First, find a good location in your yard away from the house and away from low-hanging limbs. Also, make sure it's a spot that won't collect water. Next, mark the layout. We're creating a round patio, so we're using marking paint attached to a string and stake to create a compass. Then dig up the area. The fire pit will be a 2-inch layer of paver base on the bottom, concrete blocks on top to form the ring, 4 to 6 inches of paver base behind, an inch of sand, followed by the patio stones, then finished with mortar and polymeric sand. The depth of the pit depends on the thickness of your patio stones and concrete block lining. Next, tamp the ground. We're adding a drain under our base to keep our pit from filling with rainwater. Pour a little paver base where the concrete blocks will sit. Tamp it, and set the concrete blocks on top to form a ring. Pour the gravel paver base around the blocks, 2 to 3 inches at a time. Wet it, and tamp. Continue adding the paver base to about an inch below the concrete blocks, and fill the blocks too. Then pour lava rocks or gravel into the pit to help hold the blocks. To get a level sand base for the pavers, lay PVC pipes on top of the gravel base. Pour paver sand over top, then use a straight 2x4 to screed the sand to a flat finish. Now, lay the patio stones. Use a piece of plywood to work on top of the sand. Set the stones around the fire pit ring, over the concrete blocks. To cut the stones, mark them, and cut using a circular saw with a concrete blade. Continue installing, working your way outward. Leave at least a half-inch gap between stones, and use a level to keep the tops even. Add mortar along the inside to hold the stones and sand in place. Then add edging with landscape spikes. After the pavers are down, add sand to fill the joints. We're using polymeric jointing sand, which has additives that provide a better bond. Sweep it into the joints, and use a hand tamper to settle the sand. Add more sand and repeat as needed. Remove all of the excess with a leaf blower to prevent hazing. Then lightly spray with a hose. Finish by covering with soil or gravel. Surround the fire pit with comfortable furniture.
To start, measure and mark out the deck area using pegs and string line. Then, measure diagonally across from post to post. If both the measurements are the same, then you know it's square. Or you could use a set square to do this. You can then remove the turf and all vegetation from inside the area to a minimum depth of 50 millimeters. Once the area has been dug, place a post into position in the corner of your frame and measure and mark out 100 millimeters from each face. Remove this soil to a depth of 700 millimeters, being sure to look out for any cables or pipes as you go. Once the soil has been removed, you should be left with a 300 by 300 millimeter square. This is where you'll be adding the postcrete. Repeat this for the other 3 corners. Next, split a concrete block in 2 using a brick bolster. Then place a section of block into each of the holes, making sure they're firmly in place. Take a length of post that is slightly longer than you need, as you can cut it down later, and place it into the hole. Use small pieces of timber to create props that will hold the post in place until you're ready to postcrete, and secure them to the joists with screws. It's important that you keep checking the posts are level as you go. Repeat this for all 4 corners. Now it's time to pour postcrete or a concrete mix into the holes to make sure they're permanently fixed in place. Ensure the posts remain truly vertical. You also want to create a gentle slope away from the timber posts on all 4 sides to help rainwater run off, and so prolong the life of the wood. Leave the postcrete for around 20 minutes and then check it's set. Then remove the props. Create a string line around the 4 corner posts to help you to mark and place the guides for the remaining posts. To do this, measure from post to post to find out where the centre point is. Then, measure and mark out your midpoint before hammering a post marker into place. Bear in mind that posts shouldn't be further apart than 1500 millimeters. Repeat this until the 5 post markers are in place. As you did with the corner post, dig out the holes to a depth of 700mm and a width of 300mm and place the concrete block into position. It's now time to prepare the outer frame. If you're on a slope, then always measure from the corner where the deck will be at its highest off the ground. Mark on the post where the highest part of the frame will be. Cut the outer frame joists to length. Next, line up a piece of frame with your mark and temporarily secure it in place with a 64mm deck screw. To ensure rainwater runs off your deck and away from the house, you need to allow for a slight fall in the level of the deck frame. You should factor in a 2mm fall for every metre. Bear in mind this fall when checking the levels throughout the build. Put your spirit level on top of the frame and lift until it's at the required level, and when it is, secure it to the other corner post. Line the next piece of frame up with the corner of the one you've secured and repeat this process for all 4 sides. Then, double check that each side is level. Mark on the frame where the midpoint of the post is and use a set square to draw a straight line downwards. Draw guide marks 40mm from the top and 40mm from the bottom of the frame. Next, use a 40mm flat wood drill bit to make countersunk holes around each of the marks before using an 8mm wood drill bit to drill pilot holes. Hang a washer on the end of a 100mm coach screw, insert it into the hole and hand tighten before securing it firmly in place with a 13mm socket. Repeat this on each of the other corners. Next, mark on the frame where the centre of your support posts will be positioned and repeat the process of marking and drilling the countersunk holes. Put the post into position onto the concrete block, making sure it's level before clamping it into place. You can now drill your pilot holes before securing the frame to the post with a washer and 100mm coach screw as before. Simply repeat this for all the posts on your outer frame. You can now add your centre post and support joists. Bear in mind when measuring that these joists should run in the same direction as your deck boards. Firstly, measure from the inside of the frame on one side to the inside of the frame at the opposite side, and then cut a length of joist accordingly. Attach the joist to the post at each end and secure as you did the outer frame. Put the centre post into position, clamp in place, and secure as you did the other posts. Make sure the post is level before continuing. Repeat this so the centre post is sandwiched between 2 sections of the support frame. Once this is done, secure all the new posts with postcrete. To trim the posts, rest the set square on top of the outer frame and mark a line on the wood of the exposed faces and then saw. Repeat this process for all of the posts on your decking. Remember to treat the cut ends as you go. Next, measure the distance between the central support joist and the outer frame and cut sections of joist to length. Roll out your landscape fabric and cut it to size, making sure it's as snug to the posts as possible. It's best to overlap the fabric to ensure it covers all of the area that will be underneath the deck. Pour gravel onto the landscaping fabric to help hold it in place and further prevent weed growth. Smooth the gravel as you go. It's now time to mark out the placing of your internal joists. To do this, you should measure 400mm from the centre of the outer frame and mark a line using a set square. This line is the centre of where the first joist will be positioned. Repeat this at 400mm intervals down the length of the frame and add an extra joist if your final gap exceeds 400mm. Then, extend your line downwards onto the side of the frame and mark pilot holes 40mm from the top and 40mm from the bottom before drilling using a 2mm drill bit. Secure the joist in your workbench and attach a joist hanger to each end using 30mm exterior screws. To secure the joist to the frame, place it into position with the centre of the joist lining up with the 400mm spacer mark. Be sure the joist is flush with the exterior frame and use an extra pair of hands or packers to keep it in place if needs be. Drill 2mm pilot holes, then secure using 100mm external grade screws and the supplied socket bit. When fixing the joist to an unexposed side of the frame, drill a skewed pilot hole on either side before securing skewed screws into position. Once the joist is in place, secure the final 30mm screws to the joist hangers. Repeat this for the rest of the joists, making sure the top of the joist is flush with the frame before securing. Now it's time to measure out and prepare your noggins, bearing in mind that the distance between them should never exceed 1200mm. It's also easier to stagger your noggins so that you don't have to skew screws to attach them. Mark out where you want your noggins to be and measure the distance between your joists. Then, cut the noggins to size. Put a noggin into position and draw a line that marks the centre of the noggin on each joist. Measure and mark 40 mm from the top and bottom on each side. Drill your pilot holes before securing the noggin with 100 mm external screws. Then repeat this process until all the noggins are in position. Now that the frame of your decking is secure, it's time to build the steps. We're going to use pre-made step risers to do this. Start by deciding where you want the steps to be positioned. Bear in mind that they shouldn't be spaced more than 450 mm apart. Hold each step in position and mark their edges onto the wood. Measure the distance between the marks and the next step and cut sections of joist to the required lengths. Then, measure and mark out 3 evenly spaced sets of pilot holes. Clamp the sections into place, drill the pilot holes, and secure with 2 100 mm screws at each end. Your steps should be supported on solid and level ground. Next, put your first step into position, making sure that it's flush to both the top and the side of the frame. Mark 2 evenly spaced pilot holes and then drill through the side of the step and into the joist. Secure the step in place with countersunk 100 mm screws. Repeat this process for any other exposed sides of the steps. To secure unexposed sides, drill a skewed pilot hole on each side before skewing the 100 mm screws into position. Drill a final screw through the support frame and into the back of each step, being careful to avoid the other screws that are already in place. Now, take an offcut of deck board and hold it next to the step to mark where the fascia will go. Use your set square to help mark a straight line to show its positioning. Next, use a chalk line to extend the line you made across the width of the steps. Measure from the far end of the deck to the chalk line and cut a deck board to length. Put the cut deck board into position in line with the chalk. We're going to be attaching fascia boards to the decking, so need to allow for an overhang. When securing deck boards, it's a good idea to pre-drill all fixing points with a 2 mm bit to prevent boards from splitting, and if you countersink all drilled fixing points, you'll get a smoother finish. Because this board is overhanging, screw through the third groove of the outside edge to ensure it's comfortably secured to the joist. Fix with a 64 mm decking screw. When fixing the rest of the boards, always use the second groove in from either side. To ensure the boards are straight, secure with a single 64 mm screw in one end and then move to the opposite end and then back again. Make sure to keep spaces even between adjacent boards. Because timber expands and contracts with the changing weather, you should include a gap between 5 and 8 mm. Create a suitably sized spacer from an offcut of timber and use it to check the gap between boards is equal all the way along. Once the boards are all laid, measure the gap between the steps and cut sections of joist to length. These will act as additional support for your steps and can be staggered into position and secured like the previous noggins in the frame. If your top step is like ours, then it won't need a noggin, as the overhang of the frame adds the necessary support. When securing the boards to the steps, always secure the front faces of the steps first. Measure the width of the step from the outer edge and cut a piece of deck board to length, making sure you allow for enough overhang on each end so that the board is flush with the fascia. Then, hold the board flush with the top of the step and pre-drill your holes before securing with 64 mm deck screws into the second groove on each side. Now it's time to secure the first part of the top board. To do this, place the board flush with the board beneath and secure by drilling one screw into the second groove and one directly down and into the section of board below. Depending on the steps you're building, you may have gaps that need filling, as we do. Start by measuring the gaps and marking the required size onto deck boards, remembering to subtract 10 mm to allow for the 5 mm expansion on either side. Secure your board and use your chalk line to create a clear line. Then carefully cut along the line using a jigsaw. Once the sections are cut, put them into position and secure with deck screws into the centre of the board and the first groove, making sure the screws sit centrally into the frame of the step below. Then repeat this for all the gaps. Your steps are now complete and it's time to add the fascia boards. Measure and cut the length of board you need. Then mark pilot holes into the second grooves at 50mm from each end. Repeat this at 600mm intervals down the length of the fascia. Finally, attach with 64mm decking screws and repeat this for all complete boards. If, like us, you need to add an angled board because your garden is sloping, then start by attaching packers to the main joist frame. This will give you something to secure the fascia onto. Then, take an offcut of deck board and slide it underneath the top fascia until it nearly makes contact with the ground. Mark a line onto the top fascia to show its position. Then, mark on the wood where the far end of your angled board will be and measure along to your line on the top fascia. Next, measure the distance between the end of the angled board and the ground. When doing this, remove 5mm as you don't want the board to be touching the ground at any point. On your deck board, mark where the full board will end, where the angle will begin, and where the angle will end. Connect the marks where the angle will begin and end with a chalk line. Then, cut down this mark with a circular saw. Secure the board to the packers using 64mm deck screws and repeat this process for all other angled boards. Add gravel for an attractive finish and to aid drainage around your decking.